The ground trembled violently, the earth groaning under the weight of the shifting plates. For a split second, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a deafening crack, the walls of the farmhouse shuddered, and the floor beneath them lurched. The wooden beams of the barn groaned in protest as the roof began to buckle, sending dust and debris falling in thick clouds. Emma screamed, clutching the doorframe for support as the windows rattled in their panes. Outside, the animals were in chaos. The pigs squealed in fear, the chickens flapped in terror, and the cows bellowed, all caught in the relentless shaking. Chapter 1: The Calm Before the Storm. John and Emma woke up to the gentle hum of the countryside, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. Their small farm, nestled on the outskirts of a quiet town, was a sanctuary of life. The morning sun stretched lazily across the sky as they stepped outside, greeted by the familiar sounds of clucking hens, snorting pigs, and the soft lowing of their 2 cows. The rabbits, housed in their wooden hutch, twitched their noses as Emma scattered fresh greens for them. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who had spent decades caring for animals, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. John, wearing his ever-present cowboy hat, walked toward the pigsty, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The pigs were particularly restless that morning, pacing in their pen, their snouts digging into the soil with unusual urgency. Emma paused, watching them with a slight frown. "They're nervous," she said, glancing at John. "They always act like this when something's coming." John adjusted his hat and looked up at the sky. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with something unseen. He had spent enough years working the land to know that nature often whispered warnings before it struck. The forecast had mentioned a storm, though nothing too alarming. Still, John decided to secure the barn doors and double-check the fences. He walked past the duck pond, where the water rippled from the frantic movements of the birds. Even the geese, usually loud and territorial, were oddly subdued. Inside the house, Emma turned on the old radio, hoping for an update. Static crackled before a steady voice announced worsening conditions. A sudden drop in temperature, strong winds, and the possibility of hail. John entered, wiping his hands on his worn-out jeans. "Looks like we're in for more than just a little rain," he muttered. They worked quickly, reinforcing the weaker structures, making sure the animals had shelter. The cows were led into the sturdier barn, the smaller animals secured in their pens. The pigs, however, refused to settle. They huddled together, their eyes wide with unease. The first rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying the scent of impending rain. The sky, once bright and clear, darkened with an eerie speed. Then the first hailstone fell, small, harmless, then another, and another. Within moments, the gentle tapping turned into a deafening roar as ice pelted the rooftops, bouncing off the ground with alarming force. Emma stood by the window, watching in growing horror as the storm escalated. The wind howled, rattling the walls. The trees bent under its force, branches snapping and flying through the air. Then, a sickening sound, the unmistakable crack of wood splintering. John barely had time to react before the roof of the pigsty gave way. The hail, relentless and brutal, tore through the exposed structure. The pigs screamed, their panicked squeals barely audible over the storm. Emma clutched the edge of the kitchen counter, her breath shallow. "John, I'm going out there," he said, already reaching for his coat. Emma grabbed his arm. "You can't. It's too dangerous." The power flickered once, twice, then everything went black. The house plunged into darkness. The storm raged on outside, the wind shrieking like a wounded beast. The pigs' cries became more frantic. Emma gripped John's arm tighter, her mind racing. They had to act fast. If they didn't, they might lose everything. Chapter 2: Destruction and Loss. The morning after the storm, the farm stood in eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of weakened wood and the distant caw of crows. John and Emma stepped outside, their breath catching in their throats as they took in the devastation. The roof of the pigsty had completely collapsed, jagged wooden beams and broken shingles littering the muddy ground. One side of the barn had caved in, its walls cracked and sagging under their own weight. The house had fared better, but not without scars. Deep cracks marred the stone walls, and part of the roof above the kitchen had shifted dangerously. Emma clutched John's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "The animals," she whispered. They ran toward the pigsty, the thick mud sucking at their boots. The pigs were huddled together in the corner, their bodies bruised and scraped. One lay on its side, breathing heavily, a nasty gash across its flank. Emma dropped to her knees beside it, her hands trembling as she examined the wound. "We need to clean this," she said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her chest. John nodded, already reaching for the old metal bucket near the water pump. He tried the handle, but the pump only groaned in protest. "No water." Emma wiped the sweat from her brow. "We'll have to use the well." John hesitated, then headed toward the stone well near the garden. He lowered the bucket, expecting the usual crisp, clear water, but when he pulled it back up, the liquid inside was murky, tinged with a sickly brown. His stomach sank. "Emma," he called. She hurried over, peering inside the bucket. "Oh no," she murmured. The storm must have stirred up the sediment, or worse. They exchanged a look. Without clean water, treating the animals would be nearly impossible. Before they could think further, a rustling noise came from the rabbit hutch. Emma turned just in time to see the last of the wooden slats give way, the small creatures bolting in every direction. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she groaned, pushing stray hair from her face. John sighed, setting down the bucket. "You get the pigs, I'll get the rabbits." As Emma returned to the injured pigs, trying to calm them, John trudged after the escaping rabbits. The chase led him through the ruined vegetable patch, past the overturned feeding troughs. He managed to catch two by hand, but the others disappeared into the tall grass. A sudden movement at the edge of the field caught his eye. A lone figure standing near the fence. Their neighbor, an older man named Henry, watched with a grim expression. John wiped sweat from his brow and approached him. "Morning, Henry." Henry didn't return the greeting. His eyes were fixed on the barn, then on the collapsed pigsty. "Bad storm," he muttered. John exhaled sharply. "Bad doesn't even cover it." Henry shifted on his feet. "You know this isn't over, right?" John frowned. "What do you mean?" Henry lifted his chin toward the sky. It was pale and cloudless, but the air was dry, unnaturally so. "The well's not the only one gone bad," he said. "Mine's dry, a few others too." Emma stepped beside John, her eyes wide. "You think?" "I don't think," Henry interrupted. "I know." The grounds cracked in places. Something shifted beneath us. The storm was just the beginning. John felt a chill run down his spine. He looked back at his broken farm, his frightened animals, the land that had always provided for them. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if it still would. Chapter 3: The Aftermath of the Earthquake. The morning sun rose over the devastated farm, casting long shadows over the wreckage left behind. John and Emma stood side by side, surveying the damage, exhaustion etched into their faces. The pigsty was nothing more than a pile of splintered wood. The barn leaned precariously to one side, and their house bore deep, jagged cracks along its stone walls. John ran a hand over his stubbled chin, letting out a long breath. "It looks worse in the daylight," he muttered. Emma, arms wrapped tightly around herself, nodded. "We have to start fixing things, John. We can't leave the animals like this." John looked at her, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We don't have the supplies for this, Em. And without power or clean water, it's going to be near impossible." The farm was eerily silent. No hum of electricity, no sound of the windmill turning. The only noise was the occasional rustling of the trees and the distant, uneasy murmuring of their livestock. John walked over to the outdoor faucet, turning the handle. Nothing. The well water had been murky yesterday, and now it seemed the whole system had given out. He frowned, glancing at the sky. There were no signs of rain. If the well had run dry, they were in trouble. Emma joined him, gripping his arm. We can ration what we have for now, but it won't last long. They walked to the storage shed where they kept emergency supplies. Emma lifted the lid of their water barrel, peering inside. The water level was dangerously low. Maybe we can check the creek, John said. Emma hesitated. If it hasn't dried up. The conversation was cut short by a sharp, acrid scent on the wind. John lifted his head, his body tensing. You smell that? He asked. Emma inhaled deeply, and her eyes widened. Smoke! John turned toward the horizon. In the distance, a thin column of dark smoke twisted into the sky. The earth had been dry even before the earthquake, and now, with so much debris scattered around, a fire could spread dangerously fast. We need to be ready, John said. If it gets closer, we might have to move the animals. Emma nodded, but her face was pale. They had barely recovered from the storm, and now a fire? How much more could they take? As they made their way toward the barn, Emma suddenly grabbed John's arm. Something's wrong with the cows. John followed her gaze to the pasture where their 2 cows stood near the water trough, their heads low, tails flicking anxiously. Neither of them was drinking. Emma approached cautiously, stroking the side of the nearest cow, Bella. The animal shuddered under her touch, letting out a low, uneasy moo. They haven't touched the water, Emma whispered. John furrowed his brow, stepping forward and dipping his fingers into the trough. The water looked clear, but something about it felt off. Emma's voice trembled. John, what if the well is contaminated? John clenched his jaw. If the earthquake had shifted the ground enough to crack open their stone walls, who was to say it hadn't done the same underground? If something had seeped into the water supply, we can't let them drink it, he said. Emma nodded. We'll have to find fresh water somewhere. But where? As the sun began to set, exhaustion pressed down on them. They had spent the day reinforcing the barn as best as they could with the materials they had, checking the animals for injuries and trying to come up with a plan. But with no power and no water, their options were limited. Just as John was about to suggest turning in for the night, a familiar silhouette appeared at the edge of their property. A man approached, his figure backlit by the orange glow of the sunset. John narrowed his eyes, then his face softened. It's Mark. Emma turned, relief washing over her face. Mark had been John's friend since childhood, a man they could always count on. But as he drew closer, his expression was grim. You look like hell, John said, trying to force a chuckle. Mark didn't smile. You don't look much better. Emma stepped forward. What happened? Mark sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I came to warn you. It's not just your well. Other farms, their water's gone bad too. Some folks are saying the quake did something underground. Maybe cracked the pipes, maybe worse. John felt a chill creep up his spine. How bad are we talking? Mark hesitated. Bad. Some animals have already gotten sick. Emma's breath hitched. She looked back at their cows, then at the trough. John exhaled slowly. What do we do, Mark? Mark's face darkened. I don't know yet, but if we don't figure it out soon, we're all in trouble. The 3 of them stood in silence as the last light of day faded, the farm stretching before them like a wounded beast. The world they had known was shifting beneath their feet, and the worst part was, they had no idea what would come next. Chapter 4, The Beginning of the Drought. The days stretched on, each one hotter than the last. The sky remained a relentless, cloudless blue, offering no sign of relief. The land, once lush and green, had begun to turn a brittle shade of yellow. The soil cracked under the merciless sun, and every step John took sent up a small puff of dust. Emma stood by the kitchen window, wiping sweat from her brow as she looked out over the farm. The animals were restless, suffering in the heat. The pigs huddled in whatever shade they could find, their pink skin reddened by the sun. The cows stood lethargically by the trough, nudging at the water that was quickly evaporating. John emerged from the barn, his shirt clinging to his back. He pulled off his hat and fanned himself. The well's running low, he called out. Emma's stomach clenched. How low? John's face was grim. Enough that if we don't get rain soon, we'll be in real trouble. Emma knew what that meant. No water for the crops, no water for the animals, and soon no water for them. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, the heat pressing against her like a heavy blanket. We have to do something, she said. John exhaled, glancing toward the barren land beyond their property. We need another well. Emma's eyes widened. John, that's... I know, he interrupted. It's not easy, but we don't have a choice. A deep sigh escaped her lips. Digging a well without proper equipment was almost impossible. It would take weeks, maybe longer, and they didn't have that kind of time. But John had always been stubborn, and she knew once he set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. That afternoon, John grabbed a shovel and started digging. The sun blazed overhead, and sweat dripped from his brow as he drove the blade into the hardened earth. Every strike sent vibrations up his arms, but he kept going. Meanwhile, Emma tended to the pigs. They lay on their sides, panting heavily. One of the younger ones, barely a year old, was sprawled out with its eyes half closed. Emma's heart ached at the sight. She ran to the house, grabbing old towels and a bucket of water. She soaked the cloths and hurried back, draping the cool fabric over the pigs' bodies. They stirred slightly, their breathing slowing, but it wasn't enough. They needed shade, they needed water, more than she could provide. As the afternoon dragged on, Emma noticed the geese and ducks making their way toward the river. They moved sluggishly, their wings hanging low. She followed them, her boots kicking up dust with every step. When she reached the riverbank, her heart sank. The water was lower than she had ever seen it, a thin, sluggish stream instead of the rushing current it used to be. Worse still, the surface was covered in a murky film, and the smell was wrong. She watched as one of the geese dipped its beak into the water, only to pull back and shake its head violently. Emma backed away. If the river was contaminated, they couldn't rely on it either. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat on the porch, his hands covered in dirt, exhaustion written across his face. Emma joined him, a pitcher of what little water they had left in hand. She poured them both a glass, then hesitated before speaking. John, the river, it's bad. He took a long sip before setting the glass down. I figured as much. She studied him carefully. How deep did you get today? John let out a humorless chuckle. Not deep enough. They sat in silence, the weight of their situation pressing down on them. Then, as if fate had one more cruel twist in store for them, Emma heard the crackling voice of the town's radio broadcast drifting from the open window. Due to the ongoing drought, water restrictions are now in place. Residents are urged to conserve water wherever possible. Agricultural use will be limited. Emma's throat tightened. John stared ahead, his jaw clenched. That's it, then. If the town was rationing water, their farm was in even greater danger than before. Emma reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. We'll find a way, she whispered. John didn't respond. He simply sat there, staring at the parched land before them, knowing that time was running out. Chapter 5: The Struggle for Water. The morning sun had barely risen when John and Emma set off for town. The air was already thick with heat. The ground beneath their feet cracked and dry. Every step they took kicked up a small cloud of dust, clinging to their clothes like a reminder of their worsening situation. The town was eerily quiet. The usual hum of morning activity had been replaced by a tense stillness. People gathered near the central water station, forming a slow-moving line. A large sign had been placed at the entrance. Water distribution, rations in effect. John exhaled sharply. This is worse than I thought. Emma adjusted her sun hat, glancing around at the anxious faces. We'll take what we can and make it last. When they reached the front of the line, a town official handed them a single container, far less than they needed. This is all? John asked, gripping the handle. The man gave him a tired look. Next distribution is in 3 days. Make do. Emma placed a gentle hand on John's arm, sensing his frustration. They turned away, making their way back to the farm in silence. By the time they arrived, the heat was unbearable. Emma went to check on the animals, but the moment she stepped into the rabbit hutch, her heart sank. One of the younger rabbits lay on its side, barely moving. Its fur was damp with sweat, and its tiny breaths came in quick, shallow gasps. Emma knelt beside it, stroking its soft back. "Oh, sweetheart." She rushed inside, wetting a cloth with the little water they had left and returned, dabbing the rabbit's ears to cool it down. John appeared at the doorway. "What's wrong?" She looked up, her face filled with worry. "I think it's dehydrated." John rubbed his forehead, glancing toward the sky, as if silently begging for rain. That night, unable to sleep, Emma sat on the porch, watching the land bathed in moonlight. Then she had an idea. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she gathered every clean sheet and cloth she could find and spread them out across the yard. By dawn, tiny droplets of morning dew had formed on the fabric. Carefully, she wrung them out into a bowl, collecting every precious drop. It wasn't much, but it was something. John, meanwhile, had been working on another solution. He had remembered the old water reservoir at the edge of the property, unused for years but still standing. If he could restore it, they might have a backup supply. But when he reached it, his hope vanished. The metal was rusted through, cracks ran along the sides, and a large hole had formed at the base. It wouldn't hold water, not without repairs they couldn't afford. He kicked a rock in frustration. Emma found him sitting beside the damaged reservoir, staring at it with tired eyes. "We'll figure something out," she said softly. Before he could answer, they heard the sound of footsteps. Turning, they saw their neighbor, Henry, approaching with a confident stride. "I hear you two are struggling," Henry said, adjusting his suspenders. "Got myself a good supply of water. Could spare some, for the right price." John narrowed his eyes. "What price?" Henry grinned, leaning in slightly. "A portion of your land." Emma stiffened. John's hands clenched into fists. They had fought too hard for this farm. But without water, what choice did they have? The weight of the decision settled over them like the unrelenting heat. Chapter 6. Unexpected salvation and a new threat. John paced the yard, sweat dripping down his forehead. The sun was relentless, the air thick and dry. Every living thing on the farm was suffering. Their cows barely had the strength to move, the pigs lay sluggish in the shade, and even the chickens, usually full of energy, clustered silently in their coop. They were running out of options. Then, while searching the basement for anything useful, John stumbled upon something unexpected. A stack of old, forgotten water containers covered in dust. His heart pounded as he pried one open, his fingers trembling. The water inside was stale but still drinkable. "Emma!" he called, his voice echoing through the house. She rushed down, her eyes widening at the sight. "John, where did you find this?" "Must have stored it years ago and forgot about it." He lifted one of the containers, relief washing over him. "It won't last forever, but it'll buy us some time." Emma exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. Thank God. That evening, they rationed the water carefully, giving each animal just enough to keep them going. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The cows, especially, were struggling. Their ribs were starting to show beneath their coats, and their usually bright eyes had turned dull. "They won't survive much longer like this," Emma whispered, stroking the neck of their oldest cow, Daisy. John didn't have an answer. Then, the next morning, salvation arrived in the form of an old pickup truck kicking up dust down the dirt road. A group of strangers, wearing matching vests, stepped out, their faces sunburned but kind. "We're volunteers," one of them said. "We've been delivering emergency water to struggling farms." Emma felt tears sting her eyes. "You have no idea how much we need this." One of the men nodded. "We're happy to help, but we have one condition." John's relief turned to suspicion. "What kind of condition?" "We need labor. We're working on a water project outside of town. If one of you comes to help, we'll make sure your farm gets regular deliveries." John and Emma exchanged a look. Leaving the farm, even for a day, meant leaving the animals alone. But turning down water? That wasn't an option. Before they could decide, a scream rang out from the barn. Emma spun around and ran, her heart racing. Inside, the animals were in chaos. Ducks flapping wildly, pigs squealing, the cows backing against the wooden walls. In the middle of the hay-covered floor, a long, dark shape slithered forward. A snake! Emma gasped. John grabbed a shovel, stepping cautiously toward it. The creature hissed, coiling as if ready to strike. He hesitated, one wrong move and it could lash out at him or the animals. Emma spotted the rake leaning against the wall and grabbed it. "I'll distract it." She stomped on the ground, making noise, and the snake turned toward her. In that moment, John swung the shovel down. The reptile writhed for a moment, then went still. Emma exhaled, her hands shaking. "We need to check the whole barn. If there's one, there might be more." John wiped his brow. "I'll take care of it." As the animals settled, Emma stepped outside, trying to calm her nerves. That's when she saw them. Strange footprints near the fence. Her stomach clenched. They were too large to belong to any of their animals. And they hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had been on their farm last night. Chapter 7, Dangerous Compromises. John stood near the old truck, watching the volunteers unload barrels of water. His fingers tightened around the strap of his overalls. Accepting help from strangers never sat well with him, but what choice did they have? The animals were suffering, and the well was nearly dry. Emma approached, her expression tense. "Are we sure about this, John?" she whispered. John exhaled slowly. "We don't have much of a choice, do we?" The lead volunteer, a wiry man with sun-roughened skin, clapped John on the shoulder. "You made the right call, old man. You help us, we help you." John nodded, but unease settled in his gut. That afternoon, as they worked, Emma noticed something strange. The geese were leaving. They waddled toward the dried-up stream, honking uneasily, their usual territorial nature subdued. She'd never seen them act like this before. "They sense something," she muttered. John barely had time to respond when Daisy, their oldest cow, let out a deep, mournful sound from the pasture. The others followed suit, pacing in distress. "Now what?" John grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. Emma hurried toward the barn, but before she could reach the gate, one of the pigs collapsed with a weak squeal. The others crowded around it, sniffing nervously. Emma knelt beside the animal, her heart pounding. "John, something's wrong." John watched in horror as another pig stumbled, then fell. He turned sharply to the volunteer leader. "What the hell is in that water?" The man hesitated, his expression unreadable. "It's clean mostly. It's been treated, but it should be safe enough." Emma shot to her feet. "Safe enough?" John grabbed a bucket, sniffing the liquid inside. Smelled off, metallic, almost. He cursed under his breath. "We gave this to the cows, Emma." A cold wave of dread washed over her. "We have to check them. Now." They ran toward the pasture, just in time to see Daisy stumbling toward the edge of the ravine. Her legs trembled beneath her, her breath coming in heavy gasps. "No, no, no," Emma cried, rushing forward. The cow took another unsteady step, and the ground crumbled beneath her. Without thinking, Emma dove, grabbing Daisy's halter just as the massive animal slid down the slope. "Emma!" John lunged, wrapping an arm around her waist, bracing against the weight. Daisy bellowed in panic, her hooves scrambling for grip. Dust and loose rocks tumbled down the ravine. "Hold on!" John gritted his teeth, muscles straining. Emma dug her heels into the dirt, whispering soothing words to the terrified cow. Slowly, painfully, Daisy steadied herself. John tugged hard, and together they guided her back to safety. Emma collapsed against the fence, shaking. "That water is poisoned, John. We can't trust them." John wiped his forehead, his jaw tight. "No, we can't." As night fell, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap. The footprints Emma had found near the barn haunted his thoughts. Someone had been sneaking onto their land. The wind was eerily still, the usual nighttime sounds muted. Then movement, a shadow slipping through the trees near the pasture. John tightened his grip on the rifle. Whoever it was, they were coming back. And this time, he was ready for them. Chapter 8. A new water source. John sat on the porch, running a calloused hand over his face. The heat was relentless, pressing down on the land like an iron weight. The animals were suffering, the crops were wilting, and the well was nearly dry. But there was hope. Word had spread that a new well had been drilled in a nearby town, and fresh water was finally available. "We have to go," John said, pushing himself to his feet. "If we can get enough, we might be able to hold on a little longer." Emma wiped sweat from her brow. "Do we even have enough to pay for it?" John didn't answer. He didn't know. The drive to town was slow and tense. Dust kicked up behind the old truck as they made their way down the cracked road. When they arrived, the scene was worse than John had imagined. A long line of desperate farmers stretched down the street, each waiting their turn to fill whatever containers they had. A large sign stood at the entrance. "Water for sale, limited supply." John clenched his jaw. Water wasn't free anymore. When his turn finally came, he approached the vendor, a broad-shouldered man with sunburnt skin. "How much?" John asked. The man barely glanced at him. "Depends on how much you need." John took out his wallet, flipping through the few bills he had left. "Enough for the animals, at least." The vendor scoffed. "Ain't cheap. You got real money?" John's stomach twisted. Even with everything they had left, it wouldn't be enough. Back at the farm, Emma knelt beside one of the pregnant sows, stroking her side gently. The poor thing was exhausted, her breathing heavy. "She's close," Emma murmured, glancing at John as he walked up. "She needs water, John. More than we have." John swallowed hard. "I'll find a way." That night, he made the hardest decision yet. The next morning, he drove into town again, this time with his old tractor hitched to the back of the truck. It was rusted but still worked, a machine he had relied on for decades. At the trading post, a younger man eyed it carefully. "Does it run?" John nodded. "Needs a little care, but she's solid." The man considered for a moment before shaking his head. "Not worth much." John's hands tightened into fists. "What can you give me?" When he returned home, he had 2 barrels of water. It wasn't enough. As he pulled into the driveway, he saw Emma standing by the barn, her eyes fixed on the sky. He followed her gaze, and his heart leaped. Dark clouds had gathered on the horizon. John exhaled, his grip loosening on the steering wheel. Maybe, just maybe, their prayers were about to be answered. Chapter 9. The long-awaited rain. The first drop of rain fell, splashing against the parched earth with a sound that was almost like music. John stood on the porch, eyes squinting against the downpour, watching as the land began to drink greedily. The brown dust of the dry days quickly turned to mud, and the air, once heavy with heat, now smelled of fresh moisture and relief. The rain had finally come. "We're going to make it, Emma," John muttered, a rare smile creeping onto his face. Emma stood beside him, wiping the wet strands of hair from her face, her lips pressed tightly together. She wasn't as sure as he was, but there was something in the way the earth seemed to absorb the rain that felt like a promise of survival. The animals, sensing the change in the air, began to stir. The pigs, normally so subdued and lazy in the heat, now charged out from their pens, their hooves slapping the muddy ground, grunting in joy. The ducks quacked loudly, flapping their wings and diving into the nearest puddles, the geese honking in a chorus of delight. Even the cows, their usually placid faces lit with curiosity, stepped cautiously out of the barn and stood in the rain, drinking deeply from the earth. Emma laughed softly. "They know what it means," she said, shaking her head. "I've never seen them so happy." But just as quickly as the joy began, the sky darkened, and the winds picked up, howling in sudden fury. The gentle rainfall turned into a torrent, a curtain of water that pounded the earth, turning the soil to slush. Then, the winds picked up in a terrible gust, ripping through the trees with a force that snapped branches and sent debris flying across the yard. Emma's smile faltered as the gusts hit. "It's too much. We have to protect them." Without wasting a second, John grabbed the lantern and began rushing toward the barn. "The pens need reinforcing," he shouted over the storm. "Grab the hammer, Emma. We don't have much time." They worked quickly, securing the pens with whatever they could find, reinforcing the structures to protect the animals from the rising wind and pouring rain. The trees surrounding the farm groaned, their trunks bending under the pressure, their leaves shredded by the storm. John barely noticed the cold as he worked. His mind was focused entirely on the safety of the animals. He heard Emma calling from behind him, her voice muffled by the wind. "The barn roof! It's leaking again!" John cursed under his breath. They had only just fixed it, but the storm was too powerful for any repairs to hold. He turned to face the barn, watching as rainwater began to trickle down the walls, soaking the hay inside. "We can't let it get worse," he shouted, motioning for Emma to follow him. "We need to get everything out of there. Fast." Together, they raced to move the supplies and animals that were still inside the barn, working in the thickening rain. The smell of wet hay and earth filled the air, mixing with the scent of the storm. The thunder roared above them as the storm intensified, the once gentle rainfall now a violent, cascading torrent. For a moment, it felt as if the entire world were crashing down. But John could feel the tiniest flicker of hope burning inside him. The land was drinking in the rain, the animals were safe for the time being, and they were doing everything they could to hold on. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the storm began to pass. The wind slowly died down, the rain easing into a light drizzle. John and Emma stood in the quiet aftermath, their clothes soaked through, but their hearts lighter than they had felt in months. Emma looked at the barn, the water now pooling in the yard, the trees still swaying in the calm after the storm. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" she asked, her voice soft. John nodded, his gaze steady on the horizon where the clouds were beginning to part. The sun was breaking through the heavy clouds, casting a golden light on the farm. The earth, thirsty and cracked just hours before, now looked green and alive. "Yes, Emma," John said quietly, "we're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. Chapter 10. A New Life. The storm had passed, but the work was far from over. The farm was a mess. Mud everywhere, fences broken, and the barn still leaking in places. But it was theirs. It had always been theirs. The land had tested them, battered them with a ferocity that made them question everything. But now, as the rain began to clear and the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, there was a quiet promise in the air. A promise that things could and would be rebuilt. John stood at the edge of the field, watching the animals as they slowly began to come back to life. The pigs, once thin and listless from the heat and lack of food, were now growing stronger, their bodies round and healthy. They trotted around the yard, their snouts grunting contentedly in the fresh grass. The ducks, who had scattered during the storm, were back in the pond, their quacking filling the air. The geese honked merrily, and even the rabbits, who had been so distressed, seemed to find comfort in the renewed calm of the farm. They were all bouncing around in the grass, their tiny paws moving quickly as they explored their home once more. Emma stood beside him, a soft smile on her face as she watched the animals. She had been working alongside John since the storm had passed, cleaning, mending fences, and checking on the animals. Their hands were rough and calloused, their bodies sore from the unending work, but there was a deep satisfaction in their eyes. The worst had passed, and they had made it through. "Look at them," Emma said quietly, her voice filled with contentment. "They're happy again." John nodded, glancing over at her. He could see the change in her. Her shoulders no longer hunched in exhaustion, her eyes no longer filled with worry. She was lighter, freer. He had seen her stress and struggle throughout the past months. But now, there was a peace settling over her, and he felt it too. The well, which had been nothing but a dried-up hole for weeks, was now beginning to fill with water once again. The rains had come, and the earth was slowly replenishing itself. It wasn't going to happen overnight. There would still be dry days ahead, still difficult work. But there was water, and that meant they could keep going. John wiped his brow, glancing at the farmhouse, still standing strong despite the damage it had sustained. The cracks in the walls from the earthquake had been repaired, and the roof had been patched. It wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy again, and that was all that mattered. Emma had worked tirelessly to fix the little things around the house, to make it feel like home again. "I'm glad we didn't sell it," John said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I don't think I could have let go of this place, no matter how hard things got." Emma turned to him, her eyes soft. "Neither could I. It's our home, John. It always will be." They both knew how close they had come to giving up. There had been times during the worst of it when the weight of everything, the farm, the animals, the endless struggle, had almost broken them. But they hadn't given up. They had fought for their home, for each other, and for the life they had built together. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the farm, John and Emma made their way to the porch. It had been a long day of work, but now there was nothing to do but sit back and enjoy the evening. Emma settled into the rocking chair, her tired body finally finding a moment of rest. John joined her, a quiet sense of peace settling between them as they watched the light fade and the stars begin to twinkle above them. The farm was still standing. They were still standing. They had made it through the storm, through the drought, through every challenge that had been thrown at them. And now they were rebuilding, together. John leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the armrest beside Emma. They didn't need to say anything. There were no more words to be spoken. The work was done for the day. The animals were safe, the farm was recovering, and life was beginning again. They sat in silence, listening to the sound of the crickets in the fields, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, and the quiet contentment that comes from knowing, despite everything, they had made it. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, they were at peace with it. The world around them seemed to slow, as if giving them a moment to breathe, to savor the simplicity of life. The simple joys, the warm evening air, the quiet hum of nature, the steady rhythm of the earth beneath their feet, felt like a gift. And in that moment, as the stars blinked to life above them and the animals settled down for the night, John and Emma knew one thing for certain. They would never stop fighting for this life, this home, this farm. Together, they would keep going. And somehow that was enough.